Spring, 1943. The room is quiet except for the rhythm of machinery. Typewriters strike in measured bursts. Paper feeds through teleprinters in thin curling ribbons. Cigarette smoke hangs beneath low ceiling lights. Outside, the city moves with wartime urgency. Inside, the war feels closer, compressed into columns of numbers and letters. A young naval officer leans over a freshly printed intercept. The message is long. Repetitive. Structured. German. It has traveled thousands of miles through Atlantic airwaves, encrypted aboard a U-boat somewhere beneath cold, black water. For months, these signals have been fragments. Patterns without clarity. Now something is different. The permutations align. The rotor settings begin to yield. Words emerge where only noise existed. Convoy routes. Rendezvous points. Refueling plans. Across the ocean, German commanders believe their communications are secure, sealed within the logic of the Enigma machine. In this room, that certainty is dissolving. And as the pages continue to roll forward, the realization settles quietly among the analysts: every move may now be exposed. Before this moment, however, the story had already been unfolding for more than a decade. The story does not begin in Washington. It begins in the uneasy peace after the First World War. In the early 1920s, a German engineer named Arthur Skerbius patented a cipher machine intended for commercial security. It looked harmless enough: a compact wooden box, a keyboard, a set of internal wiring wheels. Press one key, and another letter lit up. Simple in appearance. Complex in design. The machine was called Enigma machine. At its core were rotating cipher wheels, rotors, that changed electrical pathways with every keystroke. Each letter substitution altered the next. With multiple rotors, plugboard connections, and daily key settings, the number of possible combinations climbed into astronomical figures. German military planners saw in it something invaluable, portable, flexible, and, they believed, unbreakable. By the early 1930s, as Germany rearmed under Adolf Hitler, Enigma became standard issue across the Wehrmacht. Army units used one configuration. The Luftwaffe another. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, developed stricter procedures, adding complexity that would later make naval traffic especially difficult to decipher. The assumption inside German command was absolute confidence. Mathematics would shield strategy. Cipher would protect steel. But beyond Germany's borders, others were already listening. In Warsaw, mathematicians within the Polish Cipher Bureau studied intercepted German traffic with quiet intensity. Among them was Marian Rejewski, a young mathematician trained in group theory. Instead of relying solely on linguistics, he approached Enigma as a mathematical system. In 1932, using intelligence obtained through French sources and careful reconstruction, Rejewski achieved something extraordinary. He deduced the internal wiring of the German military Enigma. It was the first real fracture in German cryptographic security. The Polish team, Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Zygalski, developed mechanical aids to speed decryption. They built replica Enigma machines. They created perforated sheets, Zygalski sheets, to detect patterns. They even designed an early electromechanical device to automate parts of the search process. But time was not on their side. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, Warsaw fell. Before the collapse, Polish intelligence officers made a decision that would alter the course of the war. They transferred their knowledge, documentation, and Enigma replicas to Britain and France. The secret crossed borders just as armies did. By the autumn of 1939, responsibility for breaking German ciphers shifted largely to Britain's Government Code and Cipher School, relocated to a Victorian estate north of London. It was called Bletchley Park. The estate became a quiet battlefield. Mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword experts, engineers, and clerks gathered in wooden huts. Among them was Alan Turing, whose theoretical work on computation would shape both wartime code-breaking and the future of computing itself. The British built upon Polish foundations. They refined mechanical methods. They developed an electromechanical device known as the bomb, named after the earlier Polish machine. To test Enigma rotor settings at unprecedented speed. Against Luftwaffe and Army traffic, progress was steady. Against the Kriegsmarine, it was not. German naval procedures were disciplined and paranoid. Operators changed keys rigorously. Weather reports were encrypted separately. Signal formats were tightened. And in the Atlantic, a new threat was emerging. German U-boats. By 1940 and 1941, Wolfpack stalked Allied convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons across the ocean. Britain, dependent on imports, stood on a knife's edge. Each torpedo strike was not only a tactical success, it was a blow against survival. Behind every U-boat patrol was Enigma traffic. Orders from headquarters. Position reports. Refueling instructions. Coordination for massed attacks. Breaking naval Enigma meant saving ships. Failing to break it meant watching the Atlantic turn into a graveyard. Early British successes were fragile. Captured codebooks from German vessels occasionally provided temporary insight. But when procedures changed, darkness returned. The war at sea was becoming an industrial struggle, shipyards against submarines, radar against periscope, escort carriers against wolfpacks. And beneath it all, an invisible contest of logic and circuitry. By 1941, it was clear that Britain could not fight this hidden war alone. The Atlantic was too vast. The intercepts too numerous. The mechanical workload too heavy. Across the ocean, another power was preparing to enter the conflict. And when the United States did, the battle against Enigma would expand beyond a single estate in England into something far larger. December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States fully into the war. Within days, Germany declared war on America. The Atlantic conflict, already brutal, widened into a true global struggle. German U-boats wasted no time. In early 1942, during what German submariners later called the Second Happy Time, U-boats operated aggressively along the American East Coast and in the Caribbean. Merchant ships burned within sight of shore. Coastal cities watched oil tankers explode against the night horizon. Convoy systems were slow to organize. Radio discipline was inconsistent. Shipping losses surged. Between January and June 1942, hundreds of Allied vessels were sunk. The Atlantic was no longer a distant battlefield. It was lapping against American beaches. Behind the torpedoes lay encrypted coordination. German naval communications relied on a more complex variant of the Enigma system. In February 1942, the Kriegsmarine introduced a new four-rotor version, often referred to as the M4. This additional rotor dramatically increased possible key combinations. For Allied cryptanalysts, months of progress evaporated almost overnight. Traffic that had once been partially readable went silent. At Bletchley Park, analysts struggled. British bombs, already running constantly, could not easily cope with the expanded search space. The Atlantic crisis deepened just as the cipher strengthened. This was the moment American cryptologic resources became decisive. The U.S. Navy had maintained its own code-breaking organization before the war, focused largely on Japanese naval systems. Known as OP-20G, it operated within the Navy Department in Washington. Its officers and civilian specialists had experience in signals interception, traffic analysis, and mechanical decryption methods. Now their mission expanded dramatically. In 1942 and 1943, cooperation between British and American intelligence services intensified into a structured alliance. Intelligence sharing agreements formalized what would later be known as the UKUSA Partnership. Personnel crossed the Atlantic. Designs were exchanged. Intercepts were pooled. The struggle against Enigma became industrial. American engineers began constructing bombs in larger numbers than Britain could manage alone. At the National Cash Register Company facility in Dayton, Ohio, engineers worked with naval officers to refine and mass-produce the electromechanical machines. These devices, towering cabinets of spinning drums and wiring, tested rotor settings at speeds impossible for manual effort. Each machine was not elegant. It was practical. Built for endurance. Built to run continuously. At the same time, the U.S. Navy established additional intercept stations along both coasts. High-frequency direction-finding arrays, HFDUF, tracked U-boat transmissions. Even when messages could not be immediately decrypted, the direction and timing of signals revealed patterns. Wolfpack concentrations could be estimated. Convoys could be rerouted. Cryptanalysis was no longer a single-room operation. It was becoming a network, antennas, cables, mechanical logic, analysts working in shifts. Women played a growing role. Thousands joined the U.S. Navy's WAVES program, filling analytical, clerical, and operational positions. They sorted intercept logs, managed punch cards, operated bombs, and cross-checked solutions. The quiet rooms of Washington expanded into entire floors of coordinated activity. Still, the four-rotor naval Enigma remained formidable. For nearly 10 months after its introduction, Allied forces were largely blind to U-boat operational traffic. Sinkings peaked in 1942. Merchant crews sailed knowing that submarines might already be waiting at predicted rendezvous points. But pressure on the cipher never stopped. Captured materials became critical. In May 1941, before America entered the war, the German submarine U-110 had been seized by British forces, yielding valuable Enigma documents. Later captures, including weather ships and damaged U-boats, provided additional codebooks and procedural clues. Each seizure shortened the blackout. American production of bombs increased search capacity. Improvements in statistical methods refined crib techniques, educated guesses about likely message content. Weather reports, routine phrasing, and standardized naval formats became entry points into the cipher. By early 1943, something began to shift. Decrypts grew more frequent. Gaps shortened. Convoy routing improved. Escorts intercepted wolfpacks with growing accuracy. Sinkings of U-boats began to rise sharply in the spring of 1943, a period German submariners would later call Black May. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat arm, believed Allied advances were due to improved radar, air patrols, and escort tactics. Those factors mattered. But beneath them was something quieter. Messages once secure were now vulnerable. German operational secrecy was eroding, line by line, transmission by transmission. And as American industry amplified British ingenuity, the cipher war entered a new phase, one in which mathematics, machinery, and manpower converged against the Atlantic fleet. This convergence would not only shape the Battle of the Atlantic. It would redefine how modern wars were fought, where the decisive ground was not always land or sea, but information itself. The war against Enigma was not fought in trenches or on bridges. It was fought by people seated at desks. Inside naval communications rooms in Washington and at British outstations, the war took the form of repetition. Long shifts. Endless strings of letters. Coffee cooling beside cipher sheets. Young officers who had studied mathematics only months before now found themselves engaged in a struggle that could determine whether convoys survived the week. Many were in their 20s. Recruits arrived from universities, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, trained in abstract logic and statistics. Others were linguists fluent in German naval terminology. Thousands of women in the WWII's program worked as operators, analysts, and machine tenders. Their work required discipline more than recognition. Success was measured in silence. When a solution emerged, there were no celebrations. Only immediate verification. Cross-checking rotor positions. Confirming plugboard settings. Testing secondary intercepts. If a decrypt was correct, it moved quickly to operational planners. If it was wrong, ships could sail directly into danger. The burden was invisible. Families rarely knew what their sons and daughters were doing. The word enigma was not spoken outside secure rooms. Even many military officers were unaware of the source behind improved convoy routing. Those who understood the secret carried it carefully. A single careless remark could alert Germany to the vulnerability of its system. The emotional strain was constant. Analysts knew that delays meant sinkings. They saw the timing. An intercept at midnight. A convoy attacked hours later. Every decrypted message was both a breakthrough and a reminder of what had already been lost. And yet the work remained steady. Patient. Methodical. Because in this war, impatience solved nothing. The machines themselves were industrial manifestations of logic. American-built bombs, constructed in Dayton, filled rooms with mechanical motion. Rows of rotating drums simulated Enigma's rotor positions at extraordinary speed. Electrical circuits tested hypotheses automatically, searching for contradictions in wiring paths. When a configuration survived the test sequence, a bell would ring. Soft, mechanical, understated. Each machine represented thousands of components. Wires, relays, shafts, switches. They were not computers in the modern sense, but they were precursors, automating what had once required days of manual deduction. Operators fed them assumptions known as cribs. Likely phrases, weather patterns, routine salutations, standardized naval signals. The bomb did not understand language. It processed possibility. Parallel to this mechanical search was traffic analysis. Even when messages remained encrypted, patterns of transmission revealed structure. Frequency spikes suggested wolf-pack assembly. Signal strength indicated proximity. Direction-finding stations triangulated coordinates with increasing precision. Technology expanded beyond code-breaking itself. Radar improvements allowed escorts to detect surfaced submarines at night. Long-range patrol aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap. Escort carriers extended air cover. Depth charge tactics evolved. Intelligence guided these assets more effectively. But the crucial difference was timing. When decrypts arrived in operational windows, before an attack rather than after, it transformed reaction into anticipation. The machines did not fire torpedoes. They did not drop depth charges. But they altered where and when those weapons were used. In the Atlantic, German U-boats operated under strict radio discipline. Short transmissions. Encoded position reports. Coordinated wolf-pack attacks. Admiral Dönitz relied on centralized control. Submarines were not independent hunters, they were components of a network directed from shore. That network depended on secure communication. If a convoy was sighted, the reporting submarine transmitted coordinates. Headquarters relayed instructions to nearby boats. Refueling tankers were assigned rendezvous points. Patrol lines shifted based on intelligence estimates. When Enigma held, wolf packs converged efficiently. When it faltered, the system began to misalign. By early 1943, Allied convoys were increasingly avoiding concentrations. Escorts appeared where submarines expected isolation. Hunter-killer groups formed around intelligence cues rather than random patrols. U-boats that once hunted aggressively began encountering resistance at calculated intervals. German commanders attributed the change to improved Allied tactics and equipment. Those explanations were partly true. But they did not account for the precision of certain evasions. Some convoys altered course hours before contact. Some patrol lines were bypassed entirely. The Atlantic was vast. Chance alone could not explain repeated avoidance. In the quiet of German command centers, confidence remained outwardly firm. The Enigma system, with its 4 rotors and disciplined key changes, was considered mathematically secure. Statistical improbability seemed protection enough. Yet in Washington and at British intercept stations, pages continued to roll from teleprinters. Coordinates. Grid references. Operational orders. The invisible thread connecting submarine to headquarters was no longer opaque. And as spring 1943 approached, the consequences of that exposure would begin to surface in unmistakable ways. From the vantage point of Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, Enigma was invincible. It was not just a machine, it was the backbone of his operational doctrine. Every patrol, every wolfpack formation, every rendezvous relied on the implicit security that the cipher promised. Orders were issued with confidence, and commanders at sea trusted that their transmissions could not be intercepted without consequence. Yet, despite meticulous discipline, subtle signs of failure began to appear. U-boats reported unexpected convoy evasions. Positions predicted by headquarters often seemed off by dozens of miles. Supply submarines arrived late or at the wrong coordinates. At first, these anomalies were attributed to human error, to weather, or to the growing skill of Allied escorts. The reality was more ominous. By early 1943, Allied decrypts had begun to expose patterns in German naval operations. Unknown to Dönitz, every calculation, every strategy, every movement could now be observed from halfway across the Atlantic. The notion of invulnerability that Enigma had provided for years was quietly dissolving. Confidence was the currency of command, and it was being undermined without a single Allied ship firing a shot. For the Allies, leadership extended beyond strategy into secrecy. Intelligence officers knew that breaking Enigma would be of no use if it compromised its own source. Strict compartmentalization became essential. Convoy rerouting, hunter-killer group deployments, and interception plans were coordinated in ways that masked the true origin of the intelligence. Admirals in Washington and London had to make difficult choices. Ships were sometimes left exposed intentionally. Commanders had to accept losses rather than act on decrypted intelligence in a way that would alert the Germans. The calculus of leadership became a balancing act between short-term survival and long-term strategic advantage. This disciplined approach required trust in analysts and in the unseen machinery of cryptanalysis. Orders flowed from intelligence offices to naval fleets without revealing their source. Every encrypted message that was read in real time became part of a silent chain reaction, one that shifted the balance of power in the Atlantic without ever touching a deckplate. There was a human cost to secrecy. Convoys sank even as analysts deciphered Enigma traffic. Merchant sailors perished in the cold Atlantic. Yet, revealing the source of intelligence, ultra-secret decrypts, would have endangered countless more ships in the months to come. The moral ambiguity weighed on those involved. Each intercept carried potential knowledge that could save lives. But acting too decisively risked exposing the method. Those in the dark corridors of Washington, Dayton, and Bletchley Park faced a quiet tension: allow some loss to protect many, all without recognition, all without the comfort of immediate heroism. The invisible war unfolded in this tension between information, action, and consequence. It was an ethical calculus measured not in medals or accolades, but in statistical survival, in the unseen adjustments of convoys, in lives saved and lost in silence. By spring 1943, the human, technological, and moral elements of the cryptographic struggle converged. Analysts worked tirelessly. bombs spun ceaselessly. Convoys moved under a protective veil of intelligence. And in Germany, Dönitz continued to trust the unbreakable logic of Enigma. Spring, 1943. The Atlantic was a theater of shadows. Convoys snaked across dark waters, escorted by destroyers and corvettes, constantly hunted by U-boat wolfpacks. Each side relied on speed, precision, and calculation. For the Germans, Enigma was the invisible shield; for the Allies, its defeat would become the ultimate weapon. The turning point began not with a battle, but with a seizure. On June 4, 1944, the British capture of U-505 off the coast of West Africa yielded an unexpected prize. Intact codebooks, rotor wheels, and operating procedures. The U-505's capture, executed by a task group under Captain Daniel Gallery, provided Allies with the keys to unlock previously indecipherable traffic. The operational significance was immediate. The intelligence flowed like a river that had been dammed. But even before that historic capture, months of painstaking work in Washington and Bletchley Park had begun to pay dividends. American bombs were running around the clock, testing rotor configurations with cribs gleaned from predictable German phrases, weather reports, standard greetings, and operational headers. Each successful decryption yielded another thread of the German command network, gradually revealing convoy schedules, U-boat positions, and refueling points. For months, Dönitz remained unaware. Wolf packs continued their hunting patterns. But by early 1943, Allied naval escorts were no longer responding reactively, they were anticipating attacks. Convoys altered course hours before detection. U-boat positions were intercepted before they could form effective lines. Merchant ships that should have been sitting ducks now traversed Atlantic waters with increasingly lower losses. The human element inside the code-breaking rooms intensified. Analysts worked in shifts, cross-referencing every decrypted message. Mistakes were not permitted. Each intercept could guide dozens of ships to safety, or, if errors were made, doom them to the depths. Night after night, teletype machines rattled the alphabet, mechanical bells rang in triumph, and yet there was no cheering. Every breakthrough was immediately verified and then applied in silence. American engineers and British codebreakers coordinated like never before. Rotor configurations were analyzed systematically, operationally, and tactically. Messages that had seemed indecipherable weeks prior began to form coherent sequences. Dönitz's network, once assumed unbreachable, was being read in real time. By May 1943, the impact became stark. Known historically as Black May, German U-boat losses skyrocketed. 95 submarines were destroyed in a single month. Thousands of men drowned, many within minutes of their boats being attacked by air patrols or escort groups guided by ultra-intelligence. U-boat morale plummeted. Training and replacement programs could not keep pace. From the Atlantic to Washington, the shift was silent but seismic. Every decrypted message had become a domino in a chain that would topple Germany's confidence at sea. The war at sea was no longer determined solely by torpedoes and steel hulls, it was being decided in dimly lit rooms filled with the clatter of keys and the mechanical hum of bombs. And as losses mounted, Dönitz would begin to suspect something. The precision of Allied operations, avoiding his patrol lines, intercepting his U-boats, could no longer be explained by chance or technology alone. The moment of revelation, however, was still approaching, and when it came, it would strike with quiet inevitability. By late spring 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz's confidence in the Enigma shield began to falter, not through direct confrontation, but through results. Convoys that should have been easy targets eluded his patrol lines. U-boats coordinated according to standard doctrine, yet consistently found themselves isolated or intercepted. The precision of Allied maneuvers was unnerving. Something had changed. The Allies, armed with decrypted traffic, orchestrated a silent hunt. Wolf packs were engaged only when victory could be assured. Convoy movements, once predictable, were now calculated with unseen foresight. Destroyers positioned themselves exactly where German commanders assumed they would not. Air patrols intercepted surfaced submarines at the very moment radio transmissions indicated their presence. Every action suggested an intelligence network that knew the German Navy's intentions before they themselves did. Operationally, the results were staggering. Hundreds of U-boats, once the terror of the Atlantic, were lost within months. The human toll was immense. Entire crews perished when submarines were sunk by coordinated attacks informed by decrypted intelligence. Dönitz faced a stark reality: the tactical advantage that Enigma had promised was gone. Orders and strategies were now compromised. The invisible wall of secrecy that had protected his fleet for years had been penetrated. Within Washington and Bletchley Park, the mood remained cautiously professional. Analysts did not celebrate each sinking. Instead, they logged new intercepts, refined rotor settings, and prepared the next operational updates. Every day brought new decrypts and confirmed what the Germans could not yet comprehend: every move, every patrol, every planned engagement was visible. The shift was irreversible. From Black May onward, the Battle of the Atlantic tilted decisively in favor of the Allies. U-boat attrition soared while Allied shipping losses declined. The previously feared threat of submarine dominance in the Atlantic was neutralized, not through mass naval confrontation alone, but through intelligence that allowed the Allies to fight proactively rather than reactively. For Dönitz, the realization of Enigma's compromise was slow, fragmentary, and horrifying. Reports of inexplicable failures accumulated, and even the strictest radio discipline could not prevent the pattern from emerging. Confidence in technology, strategy, and doctrine, once absolute, was replaced with doubt. Every operational decision now carried a shadow of uncertainty. The system that had guided a vast fleet across the Atlantic for years had, in effect, been turned against them. In these quiet yet decisive months, the war at sea was effectively transformed. The Allies had gained control not by guns alone, but by information, by cracking the code that had promised invulnerability. The turning point was complete: the German U-boat arm, once feared, was now vulnerable. And the final phase of the Atlantic campaign would be fought with this invisible advantage at the Allies' side. The aftermath of this intelligence victory would ripple across strategy, morale, and the larger trajectory of the war. The stage was set for the decline of German naval power and the preparation of future Allied operations, including the invasion of Europe itself. By mid-1943, the consequences of broken Enigma traffic were undeniable. German submarines, once the scourge of the Atlantic, were encountering coordinated Allied defenses that seemed almost prescient. Convoys moved under the invisible shield of intelligence. Escorts met wolf packs with surgical timing. Losses on both sides revealed the strategic shift. The numbers were stark. In May 1943 alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 95 U-boats, nearly a third of their Atlantic force. Crews, often young men barely trained for combat, drowned as depth charges and air patrols found them before they could reach targets. The happy times of early 1942, when U-boats hunted largely unopposed, had ended. Merchant shipping, while still imperiled, began to survive in far greater numbers. Allied operations now relied on ultra-intelligence, the decrypted Enigma messages, rather than chance. Convoy routing used predictive models informed by intercepted communications. Tankers and freighters that had previously been exposed to ambush now traversed ocean lanes with increased safety. The Atlantic had shifted from a battleground of attrition to one of calculated advantage. German command struggled to adapt. Dönitz implemented revised protocols, including increased radio discipline and dispersed patrol lines, but the advantage had already shifted. Even the introduction of new U-boat models, Type 7 and 9 variants, could not counteract the intelligence gap. Each loss compounded the crisis, reducing operational confidence and straining training pipelines. Behind the scenes, Allied cryptologists continued to refine their methods. Bombs ran continuously, intercept stations triangulated signals, and analysts cross-checked decrypts against reconnaissance and convoy reports. The coordination between Washington, Dayton, and Bletchley Park exemplified an unprecedented scale of intelligence collaboration. Human effort, mechanical ingenuity, and analytical precision merged into a silent, unstoppable force. Operationally, the tide had turned. The Atlantic was no longer a theater where German submarines dictated the tempo. Instead, the Allies dictated where, when, and how engagements occurred. U-boat commanders now faced an enemy that could anticipate movements, calculate weaknesses, and strike with precision. The psychological impact on the Kriegsmarine was severe. Morale fell as losses mounted, and confidence in previously invulnerable technology, Enigma, began to erode. Dönitz, once assured of his fleet's effectiveness, began to recognize the unseen hand guiding Allied operations. His strategic decisions, reliant on secure communications, were compromised. The Atlantic campaign had irrevocably changed. As 1943 progressed, the ripple effects of breaking Enigma became increasingly profound. Allied control of intelligence allowed not only the protection of convoys but also the shaping of strategic priorities. U-boat operations were now anticipated, thwarted, and neutralized with minimal risk to Allied shipping. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once threatened to strangle Britain, shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The loss of experienced crews compounded German difficulties. Training programs could not replace men fast enough, and U-boat effectiveness declined sharply. Even the most innovative tactical adaptations, new patrol patterns, evasive maneuvers, and technological modifications, were insufficient against the foresight provided by decrypted communications. The once dreaded wolf packs were now vulnerable and often outmaneuvered. The intelligence advantage extended beyond immediate naval operations. Ultra-intercepts informed preparations for large-scale operations such as Operation Overlord. Knowledge of German defensive positions, patrol routines, and command structures allowed Allied planners to minimize risk during amphibious landings. Decisions that once relied on reconnaissance or conjecture could now be grounded in verified intelligence, reducing uncertainty in operational planning. Yet secrecy remained paramount. The source of intelligence could never be revealed. Allied commanders deliberately allowed some attacks on convoys to proceed, sacrificing a small number of ships to protect the greater advantage. This difficult ethical calculus was essential to preserve the long-term utility of decrypted Enigma traffic. The quiet corridors of Washington, Dayton, and Bletchley Park bore witness to a moral burden invisible to the public but crucial to victory. Post-war, the magnitude of the Ultra program remained classified for decades. Only in the 1970s did historians and veterans fully appreciate the extent to which decrypted Enigma communications had shaped the Atlantic theater. Histories now confirm that the breaking of naval Enigma accelerated the decline of German submarine power and ensured the safe passage of millions of tons of material, essential to sustaining Britain and preparing for the liberation of Europe. The collapse of German operational security reshaped not only naval engagements but also the broader trajectory of the war. By controlling the flow of information, the Allies were able to act preemptively, striking with precision and timing. Technology, human intellect, and disciplined secrecy converged to neutralize a threat that had once seemed insurmountable. The stage was set for the final phases of the conflict in Europe. The intelligence victory in the Atlantic would inform decisions, protect lives, and redefine how wars could be won, not solely through force of arms, but through mastery of information itself. The story of Enigma's defeat is a story of silent ingenuity. The war was fought not only on oceans and battlefields but in dimly lit rooms, amid the hum of machines and the quiet tap of typewriters. Mathematics, patience, and human determination became as decisive as guns and torpedoes. In breaking Enigma, the Allies demonstrated that knowledge itself is power. Every intercepted message, every decrypted coordinate, Every calculated rotor setting transformed the Atlantic from a place of uncertainty into a space where anticipation replaced reaction. Ships were saved, lives were spared, and entire campaigns were guided by intelligence invisible to the enemy. Yet the victory was measured in subtlety. The people behind the breakthroughs, analysts, engineers, and operators, received little recognition during the war. They endured stress, moral dilemmas, and relentless pressure, all in the service of an outcome that the world would only fully understand decades later. Their triumph was quiet but profound, altering not only the Battle of the Atlantic but the nature of modern warfare itself. The compromise of Enigma shifted strategy, morale, and technological innovation. It revealed the limits of secrecy, the vulnerabilities of even the most sophisticated systems, and the extraordinary potential of human collaboration under pressure. In those silent rooms, the invisible war was waged, and it reshaped the future of intelligence, naval operations, and global conflict. Ultimately, the lesson endures. In war, information can be mightier than steel, foresight can outweigh firepower, and the quiet minds behind the scenes may hold the fate of nations in their hands.